Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast hosted by Eric Rostad. Join him on his 15-year journey through the immortal books. He'll share what he's learning, explore profound ideas across time and cultures, and share the one thing he always hopes to remember from each immortal book.
Today I'm going to cover the Holy Bible using the King James Version, designed and illustrated by Barry Moser. This is book 1 for my 2025 reading list. Well, I like to start off these episodes where I actually hold the book as I tell you what book that I'm covering, and this one is enormous. This is like those Bibles you see at the front of a church, just those huge ones that the pastor or the priest might read out of. One of those like just enormous family Bibles that would have been in homes in days past. And this is a big one. I think I looked up the weight. I think it's like 5.5 pounds, and it is a large Bible. And I carried this thing around with me for the last couple months, and read it mostly at home. But there were times that I would carry it about with me as well. And in 2020, I decided to start that year reading straight through the Bible, and I'd never done that before, and it ended up being quite timely. Right after I finished, the things started shutting down with COVID and all that, and so I took a few years break from doing that again, but I picked up the practice starting in 2023 and have read the Bible at the beginning of each year since then. So this is my 4th time doing it, and I just start at the beginning of the Bible in Genesis, and I read to the very end of the last chapter of Revelation. And my goal is to try to do this within the first 2 months. So to start on January 1st and to be done by the final day of February. And all 4 times so far, I have reached that goal. In 2020 and 2024, I was thankful for that extra day with leap year, as I finished both of those years on the 29th of each of those Februaries, that extra leap day. So this year I finished a few days early because I wanted to read a book about the King James Bible, and so I'll be covering that in the next episode, and that's the book I'm reading right now, one just on how the King James Bible was put together. So in this episode, I want to tell you about the experience of reading through the King James Version of the Bible this year. It's one of the oldest versions that we have, and if you've ever heard of a performance of Handel's Messiah, the words that are being used are direct from the King James Version. If you've seen the Charlie Brown Christmas special, when he says the story that's from the Gospel of Luke, that is the King James Version. If you have heard old hymns, most of those are using quotes from the Bible, and it would be from the King James Version. With literature, the Bible is quoted or referenced constantly, and so many of those, especially in English literature from the last few hundred years, they're going to be quoting, if they're quoting directly from the Bible, they're going to be using the King James Version, and maybe they don't quote directly, but there are references that if you know the language, you'll catch that that's a reference to the King James Bible. You can find this even in more modern works by such as Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. He quotes directly from the King James Version as well, and even Coolio, the rapper, he quoted from it in Gangsta's Paradise in that famous rap song. So we see the King James Version being used all the time, and most of the cultural references that are in English to the Bible are going to be referencing the King James Version. So it's very important to know that language in that sense. And just in general, the Bible has likely had the greatest impact on other literature when you compare it to any other works in history. So that's the Bible as a whole, but the King James Version has probably had the greatest impact on other English language works. So in this episode, I'd like to do 3 things. First, I just want to tell you about the things that struck me this time. So this is my 4th time reading straight through the Bible. Each time, different things stick out. And so I want to tell you about the experience this time, and I'll do that right in this first segment here. Segment 2, I will share some of the language that I just found beautiful in the King James Version. And then in segment 3, I want to tell you a little bit about how Barry Moser designed and illustrated this specific version of the Bible, and then also share a little bit of my process of reading through the Bible. So let's get started with what stuck out this year. What was interesting in the first 3 times that I did this, where I just read straight through the Bible, a theme would emerge almost immediately. And the first year in 2020, that theme was the curse. I saw it pop up in Genesis 3. And the reason it popped up is it was different than what I had thought. I thought Adam and Eve had gotten cursed, and it turns out that they had not gotten cursed, but the serpent had gotten cursed, and then the ground was cursed. And so right away I'm thinking, okay, I thought of that incorrectly my whole life. So I just kind of followed the curse throughout the Bible, and it's mentioned a lot, and there's different aspects of it. The final word of the Old Testament is curse, and then the curse gets resolved on the very last page of the Bible in Revelation, and so that was just an awesome thing to look at that the whole time. And then in the other years, there would be a theme that would pop up as well, and I would just kind of follow it through the Bible. That did not happen this year. And so I wasn't trying to like manufacture it of like, I've got to find a theme and then follow it the whole time. But I just, if something popped up, I would watch it. And so there wasn't this overarching theme that I saw, but I guess maybe a sub theme that I did follow, and this just goes more into the reading project as a whole, and it's something I covered in a recent podcast episode on direction, or that I covered it on the Substack. I think that might have been an article just talking about direction and how I see that coming up in so many different books. And so I had that on the top of my mind. So I was just noticing a lot of the language in the Bible of being that around direction. So you've got paths and ways and inclinations, and then just ideas of like none that go return. So if you're going a certain way, and so I would just kind of start making notes of these verses that would be about direction. So there's a lot in Psalms, there's a lot in Proverbs that deal with that. And there's one in Jeremiah, this is Jeremiah 6, that really stood out. And it says, "Thus saith the Lord, stand ye in the ways, and see, and ask for the old paths. Where is the good way, and walk therein, and ye shall find rest for your souls." And the quote there. Another thing that just stuck out this year, again, not just kind of not an overarching theme, but something that I saw come up quite a bit and would start making note of it. And it's just this idea of being set apart. And while I was reading through the Bible, I would write down verses that I thought were interesting, but then I also would just kind of make notes as I was reading. And so I'm just going to read the note I wrote at that time. This was day 47 of reading through the Bible. So this would have been in February. I was just thinking about how important it is to be and remain set apart. Israel sought after foreign gods continually, surrounded by other gods. The natural tendency was to adopt them. A new heart required to break this, to not even have the desire, to be set apart, holy as I am holy. So that's what I wrote there. But just how it wasn't enough just to like there had to be a step further than just trying not to do things. Like you had to set yourself apart. The Israelites were going into a land where there were other people that worshiped other gods, and you just see over and over how the Israelites would end up worshiping these gods, and even archaeological evidence, I understand, that we've found shows a mix of gods being worshipped in that area, along with Yahweh. And so just this idea that how important it was to be set apart, and just how the language, like in Ezekiel, of a new heart, and how that was almost required just so you wouldn't even have the desire to go after these other gods. So again, just something that stuck out there. Another thing is just, and I've noticed this the last few years, but I think it just startles me every time I see it, is just how much is spoken about of love. And I don't know, maybe just in my head, I'm thinking a religious text, like, shouldn't it be more about like how to live or that kind of thing. And yet there's just so much talk about love. And there's also a lot of talk about the flourishing life. Like, what does the flourishing life look like? And you see a lot of that in Proverbs and some of the other books in that wisdom literature or Psalms or that area of the Bible. But just how much that's spoken of, and then seeing it come up again in the Sermon on the Mount. I heard one time on a podcast where they were talking about the Sermon on the Mount and just the language of blessed be such and such if you are such and such. And the guy was saying another way to think of that, or another way to perhaps translate that, would be flourishing are but it's just things that you wouldn't necessarily consider as flourishing, or our world wouldn't think of as flourishing. Like, flourishing are the meek. Flourishing are you when you're persecuted, when people persecute you. And that's not what we think of in a flourishing life, but is it? I mean, is that the flourishing life? So just a ton of language around that in the Bible. Again, just this idea of reading directionally into that, and seeing that theme of direction throughout the Bible, but reading it in that sense as well, of just knowing that, each of us every day are moving in a particular direction based on our daily choices. But reading like the book of Samuel and Kings and especially Kings and Chronicles, where I'm looking at it directionally. And so there's two kingdoms. There's the northern kingdom, and then there's the kingdom of Judah. And the northern kingdom ends up not having any king that is considered good. And Judah kind of has a mix of good and bad kings as defined in the Bible. And so just that question of why did the northern kingdom not have any good king? Was that kind of set at the beginning with their first king and they just couldn't get out of that? Or, why did Judah have some good kings and the northern kingdom not have any good, the kingdom of Israel not have any good kings? And was there some directional aspect of it where they were heading in a direction they couldn't get out of that? I think that was the first time I'd ever kind of read it in that sense of looking at things directionally and trying to pick up clues, I guess, along the way of, is there something that points to how they were not able to get out of this and have a good king along the way? Something else popped out this year that I hadn't thought about before, but just how amazing it is to have different views in the Bible. So the example that I thought of in this was the difference in the book of Samuel and in Chronicles. And so they're talking about a lot of the same things. And in Samuel will even reference a lot of the time, like, and this was written about in the book of Chronicles or the book of Kings will do that as well. But Samuel, we get the story of David in Bathsheba, where David had an adulterous affair with Bathsheba, ended up killing her husband, and just made a mess of it. And that is not mentioned at all in Chronicles. And so just think of if we only had the book of Chronicles and how we wouldn't know. So like we would see aspects in Chronicles of the kingdom going in the wrong direction, but we wouldn't have that backstory of the affair and the adultery and then the murder that we find in Samuel. And just I wondered another year in reading through the Bible, like, why is this called Samuel, the book of First and Second Samuel? Why is it not, as Robert Alter calls it, the David story? Because David's one of the main people there. Like, why is it called Samuel? And I think this is almost a clue to it, is like Samuel gives us this insight that the book of Chronicles completely just glosses over, does not even mention Bathsheba. So I just found that amazing to see that in the same collection of books here of the Bible, where you've got one that contains that part of the story and another that doesn't. And just to think, what if we did not have the book of Samuel? It'd be pretty incredible. one thing I noticed in my mind happening when I was reading the Bible this year was that I would recall specific sermons that I heard about different texts. So I'd be reading a text and be like, oh man, I remember this. And I would remember the person who gave the sermon. So the pastor, the location, so the church I was at. I could sometimes picture exactly where I was sitting. And I just found that to be really interesting. And it kind of, the Bible I read in 2020, it was the Christian Standard Bible. And I actually bring that one to church now every time that we go, and I'll just write notes in it. So it's kind of become my everyday Bible, but I love like going through it again and just seeing, oh, here's what so-and-so preached on 4 years ago, and here are the notes that I took on that. And so I love that idea, and maybe it's something that you think about doing as well, where you just kind of have a main Bible, and it's one that you mark up. You don't have qualms about writing in it and that kind of thing. But you have that be something that is with you, and you add notes to it, and just to see different notes over the years is really a special thing. But I was surprised just at how often memories would come back to me of specific sermons. And the reason it stuck out to me is because these sermons some of these were like 20 or 30 years ago. And I was remembering them. And so I liked that aspect of it. And just thought it was neat. So I wanted to share that. Last thing is, and this will be my one thing for the reading through the Bible this year. And it's this idea of mocking. And there's a verse in Galatians of, do not be deceived, God is not mocked. So do not be deceived, God is not mocked. And you get this sense throughout the Bible, like you don't mess. There are things you don't mess with. And there's a lot of in the news right now of that FAFO. You can look it up. I won't say it here, but you just get that sense throughout the Bible. Like there are things you do not go past. There are things you do not do. You do not mock God. And then yet you come upon the book of Matthew, and this will be in all the Gospels, but I just want to read this part exactly. And this comes from Matthew, and this is the scene of the execution of Jesus. And it says this: "And when they had plaited a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, and a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' And they spit upon him and took the reed and smote him on the head. And after they had mocked him, they took the robe off from him and put his own raiment on him, and led him away to crucify him." And I'll end reading there. But just this idea, like you do not mock, and then yet here is the Son of God being mocked, and just that. Oh man, I like if there were two verses of the Bible that just kind of encompass so much of what happens, it's those two things of do not be deceived, God is not mocked, and then yet here is the Son of God being mocked. Let me share just reading stats quickly, and then we'll get into segment 2 of the language that really stuck out to me in the King James Version. So this was a 995-page Bible, and it took me 72 hours and 33 minutes to read through. And that's probably very close. Like when I start reading, I hit start, and then when I finish, I hit end on this app that I use. I'm just curious. I love to see how long things take, especially the Bible, just to know how long it takes. In the last segment, I'll share how long it took me the other 3 years as well. But this year took me 72 hours and 33 minutes, and that was over 57 days. So I started January 1st and finished on February 26th. So what that equals is 17 pages per day, and it took me 4 minutes and 22 seconds per page. So there were 4 columns on each of these pages. There would be some illustrations within there as well, but each page, it took, most books take like a minute to read each page, but this one was 4 minutes and 22 seconds. So again, a huge Bible, a lot per page, but it was quite the experience going through this version of the Bible this year. So let me share with you some of the statements and language in the King James Version that stuck out to me this year in the next segment. All right, the language in the King James Version is so beautiful, and it was really interesting reading through it because I thought there's a lot of like these and thous and words that we do not use anymore, and I thought that would kind of hinder the reading, but it's amazing. Like when I'm just reading it by myself in my head, you just kind of get used to it. You don't even think about it. It just your mind kind of adjusts and you understand what's going on. I did read some of it to my daughter at night when I would be reading in her room. And it was really interesting to note that because it was strange to read it out loud. And it was very difficult to read it out loud because it's archaic language and it's hard to read it. But when I'm reading it by myself in my head, it was fine. So that was interesting, but I wanted to share some of my favorite verses in words that I came across that were extremely beautiful in the King James Version. So my favorite, and I just shared, this is my favorite word that I came across, and it's peradventure. And so peradventure would mean perhaps or by chance. It's kind of like a if statement, like if. Peradventure. But I just love, like, we would probably have an if in there, like a 2-letter word, and then there's just this huge, beautiful peradventure in there instead of if or by chance. And I loved that. It was more prominent in the Old Testament. I did see it at least once in the New Testament, but I really loved coming across that word and want to try to incorporate it somehow into my own life or language. The Matrix comes up a lot. So, we're familiar with the film. There's a verse in Exodus 34, all that openeth the matrix is mine. And that's God speaking. And I just thought that was kind of cool. Number 6 contains the blessing that I'm sure you've heard. It shows up in the movie Braveheart. If you've been to a service, you've probably heard this. The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. Again, just so beautiful in that King James Version. A lot of talk about unicorns. I don't recall seeing unicorns as much in the other translations, so I'll have to look and see what word would be used instead. But there'd be talk of the strength of a unicorn and just other parts where unicorns were spoken of. Came across the hewer of wood, and if you listen to my episode on Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, you know that term shows up on the very first page of the book. And it's a startling term, and he wants it to be startling. He wants you to kind of wonder, like, what in the world is that talking about? And it is a reference to the Bible. And again, that is hewer of wood. Cormac McCarthy is using the King James Version when he quotes that. So it's important to pick that out and then kind of read the context in the Bible of what that refers to, and then that helps you understand Blood Meridian a bit as well. When we get to the book of Ruth, there's the line, "For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." I just love how that comes about. I am a teenage boy at heart, so anytime I come around those verses where they talk about the men pissing against the wall, the King James Version takes it up a notch and calls them those that pisseth against the wall. So pisseth, I liked that. Psalm 149, he will beautify the meek with salvation. Just beautiful, I love that. Lamentations 3, there is the great is thy faithfulness is a hymn, and I didn't realize it came right from the Bible, and I wouldn't have realized it in other translations, but in Lamentations 3, you see the language exactly how it is in that hymn. And I highlight this just because I would come across item after item within the King James Version where it's like, oh, I recognize that. And a lot of I would have recognized if it was different translation or whatever, but it really just sticks with the King James of, oh, there's that hymn, or there's that reference in a book or a movie, or some cultural context, and just seeing it right there in the King James was so special. Daniel 5, I love this translation. This is when the king sees the writing on the wall. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against the other. And I'll stop reading there, but just this idea of knees smoting one another, one against the other in fear, and the joints of his loins were loosed. And there's a lot of talk of loosed limbs in Greek literature, whether it's Sappho or in Homer, when someone is killed. Sappho more on a love idea where limbs are loosed, but. Man, I loved that. I just love how that was translated there. There was one instance where I didn't think the King James did as well as modern translations, and that is with the Golden Rule. So this shows up in the New Testament, and then here is the Golden Rule according to the King James Version. Therefore, all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do you even so to them. For this is the law of the prophets. We're more accustomed to hearing that as do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that's nice and pithy, nice and concise, compared to, therefore, all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them. Not as easy to recall, probably not on the tip of many young children's tongues as the general version that we are familiar with now. When we get to John the Baptist speaking about Jesus, he says, "The latchet of whose shoes I am not worthy to unloose. The latchet of whose shoes I am not worthy to unloose." I loved that. And the last one I want to highlight here is from John 11, and this is when Lazarus is dead, and they come up to Jesus and said, "Lord, by this time he stinketh." So I just love that King James wording on that, stinketh. That's great. So that concludes this part here of the language I really found enjoyable in the King James Version. In the next segment, I'll tell you a little bit about this Barry Moser Bible, the King James Version, and then the process of reading through it this year. All right, Barry Moser. He's still living. He has done a number of works where he's done illustrations from everything from narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass to Moby Dick to a number of others. And at Landmark Booksellers, where I'm business manager, we have a number of the different books that he has illustrated, and it's just fun to look through them. In this Bible, there are 232 total illustrations. So many of them will be full page. Some of them will just be kind of small ones that are within text. And they most of the time they coincide with what you're reading about. And so you'll be reading about a particular person, and then there'll be an illustration about that person. So most of the illustrations were about people. There were some of things, and then when you get to Revelation, there's some of like the seven-headed dragon and angels and different things. But yeah, most of them are of people. And it was just amazing to see these illustrations while reading the text, because I hate to admit this, but I kind of viewed illustrations as childish things until probably just a few years ago, to where I really started to pay attention to them in the books that I was reading. And part of that was just with the bookstore that I was working at and seeing these different books with illustrations and kind of taking a deeper look. But really it came about with this version of the Bible. And there's an illustrator friend of mine, Stephen Krotz, who he pulled this Bible out, the Barry Moser edition of the Bible, and he opened it up and he was showing me different illustrations. And he showed me Jonah, and he showed me these different ones, and just, look at how incredible this is, and would point things out. I was like, man, that's beautiful. And I just wouldn't have necessarily considered that or looked at it before, but I'm glad he did. And then as part of that, I ended up buying that Bible and then decided to read it during one of these times where I'm reading straight through the Bible at the beginning of the year. And so that's how I decided on this one. But it really was starting with because of those illustrations. And it was amazing as I went through this, just how much your brain picks up on these illustrations. And so somebody that I may have just kind of glossed over in reading through the Bible, like maybe a minor character, that character becomes real. It becomes something that is ingrained in, I can see the illustration in my mind now, and it just helps me remember that character. And if you've listened to other episodes, a big part of this reading project is trying to figure out ways where I can better remember what I read. And it was startling to me that the illustrations themselves helped me to remember what it was that I was reading. And so I greatly appreciated that in this Barry Moser Bible. There are a number of Dore, another illustrator. There are a number of illustrations he's done with the Bible. And so maybe another year I'll kind of look through those as I'm going through the Bible. But I hope that encourages you to consider looking at illustrations and not thinking of them as a childish thing, but maybe as a tool that can just help you as you're reading through a book like the Bible. And I wrote an article recently on Substack of my 5 favorite illustrations from this Bible. So I'll link to that in the show notes, but give that a look. There are just some stunning ones in this Bible. My favorite one is the one of Jonah. It's Jonah right after he's been thrown into the water by his shipmates, and at his behest. He knows that he's the reason that there's this storm, and they throw him in the water, and the water immediately goes calm to where there's not this storm, and the ship's fine, but Jonah's in the water, and you see the tail of this big fish behind him, and that's all you see. Is you see Jonah's dejected look, just like this. He's so despised at himself. He's despised at himself. And then there's this fish behind him. He doesn't even notice the fish. It's about to swallow him. But just the look of dejection on his face is so relatable. It's so damning. And it's so real. That's my favorite one out of the 232 illustrations. The Bible itself, how he designed it. So at the start of the Old and New Testament, there's just this huge word in red. And so for the Old Testament, it's in the beginning, God. And so God is just huge font, red font, center of the page. And then in the New Testament, beginning with Matthew, it starts, and then Christ is the big name in red, all caps, huge font. And so that's how he starts off each of those. And then within the start of each of those, then there's a block of text that is large, and it goes all the way across the page. And so in the Old Testament, that's the start of creation. And then in the New Testament, it's the genealogy of Jesus that you start seeing that. And then it breaks down into 2 columns per page. And that's how the majority of the Bible is set up then, just with these 2 columns throughout. And all of there was no empty space. So like if one book ended, it would go immediately into the next book. There wouldn't be like you just leave the bottom of the page blank or something and then start on the next page. It would just all going one from the other. But the Bible itself was broken up into 5 main sections. So there are the 5 books of Moses, the books of history, the books of poetry, the books of prophecy, and then the New Testament. And at the end of each of those, the text would end at the bottom right-hand corner of that page every single time. And I loved that because that just showed such a level of deep planning, like really considering how Barry Moser wanted this Bible laid out in terms of the font size, the layout, where the illustrations would go to where the text would end at that bottom right-hand portion every single time. I loved that. I've not seen that in the Bible before. I really appreciated that. There was one part where they deviated, and that is at the end of the Gospel of John. And so it's not a main section in the sense of like it should end, but it ended one line up from the bottom right-hand corner. And so if I ever get to talk to Barry Moser, like that's my first question of why. And I almost wondered like if he did that on purpose, just like that there's this expectation that it keeps going on or something. But he was so meticulous about the layout that there has to be a reason that ended up one line short of the bottom right-hand corner. Because he could have just made one illustration just slightly bigger and it would have pushed that down. So I'm really curious about that, but I just in general, this was so beautifully designed and laid out and considered and thought through that, you just need to see a version of this, and they might have it at a bookstore around you, but you've got to see this one in person. I recommend you buy a copy, but it is just a stunning work of art, the whole thing. So yes, there's 232 illustrations, but the design and layout, the font, it's just stunning. And so he marks at the beginning of each chapter. So it'll just be kind of bolded like chapter 2. And then you start reading the text. There are no verse references. And I love that. You're just reading. You're not seeing these small numbers above everything of what the verse is, but you do know where you are in terms of the chapter that's marked. And so it's just a clean reading experience. The pages of the Bible are thick and like just it's a solid Bible. It is really a great one to use. I'll get into when I talk about like the process of reading it this year. I'll talk a little bit about the size of it and all that, but just in general, I loved using this Bible. 995 pages, 775 of those were for for the Old Testament. So Old Testament ends right on page 775, the bottom right-hand corner, with the word curse, and then the New Testament is 220 pages. So it's so funny because like when I do this and I read through the Bible and I know it's going to take 2 months, it's like I'm so long in the Old Testament. Like I'm in middle of February and I'm still in the Old Testament. I'm like, man, is this thing going to end? And then the New Testament just goes so quickly after spending so much time in the Old Testament. So the King James Version, as I mentioned before, I'll do an episode next week just talking about more of how this Bible came about, and that's the book I'm reading right now. It's called God's Secretaries, and so this was a Bible that was put together, I think 1604 to 1611, and I'll have exact dates next week, but that's the time period we're talking about in England, done by or kind of initiated by King James, who was the king after Queen Elizabeth. So one thing I loved, I didn't know how it would go reading the King James Version. I kind of thought it would be like, the language would be so archaic that it would just kind of be like a nice experience and it would be that, but like not one that I would want to go back to, but one that I would have been glad to have read. So that going into this year, that's what I was thinking. But it quickly became a version of the Bible that I want to read again. And I'm even at this point considering having this be my main Bible going forward. And it's funny, I've got these old Bibles that my grandfather gave me, or my dad gave me, that were his father's or even his grandfather's. So I've got like 3 or 4 different King James versions of the Bible. And it's just fun to look through those. It's fun to know that that my ancestors were reading these, or my grandfather and great grandfather. These were the Bibles that they were using in their King James version, and but further to that, just knowing that this came about in the early 1600s, that means that people have been reading this version for 400 plus years, and yes, the Bible's been around a lot longer than that, and I wish I could read it in Hebrew and Greek, but I can't. And so for an English version, there was just something about knowing that it had been around that long. And then there was almost like, remember that in segment 1, I talked about just being set apart as a person. There's almost like this language is set apart in it being archaic, in just that it adds this level of gravitas to the language that sets it apart. And I know biblical scholars would argue with me on this, and maybe modern versions are better translations and all that, but it that level of gravitas to me, it just like it set this version of the Bible apart in ways that other versions and newer and modern versions don't. And I liked, like, it made it much more special to me. And that may be weird and crazy, but that was the experience I had going through the King James Version this year. And I liked it so much that I may have this be my main Bible going forward. I'm thinking there's this version we have at Landmark, just this beautiful like leather version. I'm contemplating getting it, just in having that be my main Bible going forward. But I do want to contrast that with the version of the Bible I read last year, and the version of the New Testament I read that was translated by David Bentley Hart. And one thing he did that I really liked is that he translated a lot of the New Testament into current language, but in the sense like active voice language of it's happening right now. And it'd be like if somebody was talking to me and then he says this and like it put you right there. And so I think there's an aspect of it to where a translation should do that, like not make you feel like this was written 2,000 years ago, but that you're right there. And that's one thing I really appreciated about David Bentley Hart's translation. So I'm not saying like, we got to go back 400 years to this English version of the Bible and have that be the only one, but I really appreciated it. But in those lines though, there are parts of the New Testament that are in the present voice, like not that this happened, but it like almost like this is happening. And so even the King James Version did have that feel of like, oh, this is happening right now. Like this is exciting. So I loved it. As I mentioned earlier, reading it in my head as opposed to reading it out loud was different. And so this perhaps isn't the best Bible to read out loud, just because like once you're reading for a while, like you just get used to it. But if you just read out a verse in the King James Version, it is a little startling just because we're not, it's like Shakespeare in that sense of just, it's not what we're used to. And yeah, one thing that did stick out is just how similar the words and some of the phrases that we use now. So I just kind of expected everything to be fully archaic. And there are terms and phrases that we use now that I thought, okay, these have to be pretty modern, like maybe the last 50 years. But that wasn't the case. Like here it is in the King James Version. So that was being used 400 years ago. So part of that's probably just my bias on thinking that, language has evolved and we're using, cool words now and all that. But no, a lot of this stuff was going on back then. So that was another fun part of reading the King James Version, just to see what kind of language was being used 400 years ago. So now I just want to talk a little bit about what it took to get through the Bible. Again, this is my 4th time doing it, so I kind of started to get into a rhythm of doing this. And I plan to do this the rest of my life, where I just take January and February each year to read through a different version of the Bible. So what it took, I start on January 1st. I know I'm starting the first day of the year. I try to get to bed somewhat decent on December 31st, just knowing that I want to get going right in the morning on January 1st. So I did stay up this year past midnight, but I got up relatively early on that January 1st to get going in the book of Genesis. So I start right at the beginning, start right in Genesis first, and just start reading. And I read as much as I can each day, and then go on. I know, this one was 995 pages. And so in my spreadsheet, I just I've got this equation going to where I know how many pages I need to read per day to get through it by the end of February. So I just kind of try to maintain that. It was very hard at the beginning of the year to maintain that. And, with work and getting busy with different things, like I didn't know if I would make it at first. I didn't know if I would finish by the end of February, but I did. And just kind of knowing that number of like, I need to be roughly around this number of pages per day really helps. Each time I read, I've got a number of tools that are by me. One is the maps. So I just try to reference maps whenever places are mentioned, just so I have a visual of where these things are happening. And for maps, there are no maps in the Barry Moser Bible, but that other Bible I read in 2020, there's some great maps. So I have that Bible pretty close to me, and I'll open to the back of that and look at those maps. There's also an app that I use that will actually, you can follow each book of the Bible and go by verse and then see any place is hyperlinked, and then you can click the hyperlink and it pops up this map of where it is, and it shows you things that place was known about in the past around that time, but then it also shows you what it is in modern day, what that area is. So that's a cool thing. I've got a article on Substack where I list some of the tools that I use. I've got a list of the kings that show up in Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, and so I reference that a lot just to see what king was king where, and who was the king at the same time as in Israel as there was in Judah, and that kind of thing. And then I've got a list of the prophets, who they were prophets to, whether it was the kingdom of Israel, whether it was the kingdom of Judah, whether it was pre or post-exile or during exile. And so these things just all really help me as I'm going through the Bible, just kind of a quick reference. So I'll link to that article because some of those things could be really helpful if you go through it. In the past, I would do Bible in a year type things where if you read 5 chapters a day, you can get through the whole Bible in 365 days. But I would notice that jumped around a lot, so it was just kind of hard to get the scope of stories. But reading straight through, like you just see a lot of connections, and I really like it. I did an episode a long time ago of the case for reading straight through the Bible, and I just think there's a lot of benefits. I'll read different parts of the Bible later on this year for the rest of the year, just kind of maybe each morning pick up a proverb or something like that. But there's something really special about just reading straight through. And so as I'm doing this, I'm not stopping much. I would stop and write notes and that kind of thing. And then it's on my mind if I'm doing housework or in the car or on a run or something. So I'm thinking about it, but I'm not like diving deep into any of the chapters or verses. I'm just kind of reading it like a book, like I would a novel. And like I said, there's pros and cons to that. I love the experience. And so I like doing that. I can dig deeper later in the year on other things, but this is really the purpose here is just to go straight through. For the first 3 years that I did this, I marked up those Bibles like crazy. This Barry Moser Bible, I did not want to mark it up. It's just so beautiful, and I did not want my pen marks in it. And so I had a separate journal that I would write in instead. So I would mark verses that I liked. I would write them out. Words that I liked, I would write just personal notes as I was reading the Bible. And so I had a separate book this year as opposed to writing in the Bible or in the back of the Bible. I did plan to read the King James Version of the Apocrypha between the Old and New Testament, but I ran out of time. When I finished the Old Testament, I just knew that it was going to be tight in reading, even finishing the New Testament. And then I also wanted to learn more about the King James Version of the Bible. And so that's what I'm reading now in these last few days of the month. I'm trying to finish by March because March 1st is when I get back into the Immortal Books. So I did have the Apocrypha on the list to read. So I think what I'm going to do is once I start with the Immortal Books again, in the morning, I like to read at least some part of the Bible before I start reading whatever else I'm reading. And so I think I'll probably just start with the Apocrypha on that and just work my way through it during the rest of this year, as opposed to have just read it in these 2 months. I try to read the Apocrypha every other year of reading through the Bible. And so this was the year I was supposed to read through it, but yeah, I just ran out of time. Again, it took me 72 hours and 33 minutes to read through it. I wanted to contrast that to the other years because this was the shortest amount of time that it has ever taken. And I think a lot of that was just the fact that I didn't write in this Bible. Because when I write in the Bibles, I end up taking a lot more notes. I write a lot more in the back. I'm underlining a lot more and that kind of thing. And that just adds to the time. So the first time I ever read straight through the Bible, it took 104 hours and 25 minutes. So that was in 2020, the Christian Standard Bible. That amount of time also included, like I would do a recap after every book of the Bible. So when I was finished, I would write out some notes and that kind of thing. And so that included a lot of that time too. So, this year was 72 hours. That was 104. A lot of that extra time was in kind of writing and notes and that sort of thing. In 2023, I read the Bibliotheca version, and then that included the Apocrypha, and that took 97 hours and 5 minutes. So again, just the addition of the Apocrypha, that adds about 25 hours to the project. In 2024, I read the Robert Alter version of the Hebrew Bible, so the Old Testament, and then the David Bentley Hart version of the New Testament. That took 110 hours and 55 minutes. And again, that was over January and February of last year. And the reason that one took so long is the Robert Alter translation also has a commentary, so I was referencing that commentary a lot. And then for the book of Genesis, I read every single piece of commentary. I quickly realized I would not have time to do that for every book. And so I didn't do that for the other books, but Genesis took like a very long time. And that's why last year it was 110 hours compared to 72 this year. So it's funny comparing them. Last year I spent, 30 plus hours more reading the Bible than I did this year. And you just think about that, like from January to February, I think a big part of that was that the fact that this Bible was so huge. I wasn't as inclined to carry it around with me as much. I did, but it would take up like my whole backpack, or I've got this satchel and it would take up that whole satchel. And it was also just not as easy, like even when I was eating or something, to just take the Bible and keep reading through, like the other versions that I've read that were smaller books. Like the Bibliotheca is broken up into 5 books. And so it's easy to carry one of those around because it's just 1/5 of the Bible. And then the Robert Alter, that's 3 books. And then the David Bentley Hart is a 4th book. So this year it was just 1 book, thick paper, huge Bible, illustrations and all that. And so I just kind of clocked that off in the interesting aspect of just, it's hard. If it's a huge Bible, it's harder for me to carry around. I'm not going to be spending as much of the kind of minutes throughout the day that just pop up. I won't be reading it as much in those senses, like if I'm waiting at an appointment or at the grocery store or something like that. Whereas some of these other versions, they're very easy to carry around and pull out. So check out the show notes for this episode. I'm going to include all of the previous episodes I've done about the Bible. And I will post a video about the Barry Moser Bible. So there was a documentary that was done about the creation of this particular version that he designed and illustrated. And that is super interesting. I think it's $1.99 on Amazon if you want to stream it there. It's not on Apple as far as I can remember. I will link to the articles that I wrote about the Barry Moser Bible and my favorite illustrations and that kind of thing. And then I'll link to the one that I did about the tools that I use as I read through the Bible. The last thing I will link to is the reading group I'm running right now, which I would love for you to join. It's just 1 session per month. And the tagline is short, great books. So if you have wanted to get into some of the great books, I'm doing a reading group where you can join either in person or online. And I've selected books that can be read between 2 and 5 hours. So the book for March is a tragedy play by Aeschylus, and it's the one called Agamemnon. And so that's what we're covering in March. I'd love for you to join. All you have to do is become a paid subscriber on my Substack, and you can do that for as little as $5 a month. So it's really, price of a cup of coffee, and that gets you on the list where I send you the info on that. If you live in the Nashville area, you can also join in person. And again, I'll link to the page that has all the details, the dates, what books we're covering, and all that. And I'd love for you to join. That's been a really fun thing that I've done this year. The first two books covered were we last month in February, we did Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, and that was just incredible. And then the first month in January, we did The Epic of Gilgamesh, and just great discussions, fun time. People were really surprised reading through these books, and even people who had read them before, just kind of, wow, I didn't remember these parts of it. And so we've had fun doing that. I'd love for you to join in that. That'll do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I would love to hear from you. You can email me at eric@booksoftitans.com. If you would like to comment on this episode, please do so on Substack, because then other people can see that comment. They can comment on it. We can get a discussion going. That would be great there. Like I said, next week I'm going to be covering the book about the King James Version of the Bible. So if you're interested in learning more about that, make sure you subscribe to the podcast or subscribe on Substack so you know when that episode comes out. I may do another question episode as well. I'm going to see, each year after I read the Bible, I get Dr. Jason Staples on, a biblical scholar, just probably the smartest man I know. And I just ask him questions that came up during that year's reading of the Bible. And those have been so fun. And so I may do that in a few weeks as well. You can follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter. It's just @BooksOfTitans. And I've got two different parts of the website. One is this Substack, and that's where the podcast lives. That's where I write articles. And then I've got a books.booksoftitans.com. That's where I have my reading lists. That's where I have my notes per book. Just a lot of resources there. And so you could check out both of those sites. Until next week, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.